Let's lower that down a bit. All right, let us jump in here. Time is short, I suppose. All right. Okay, so a bunch of things to get kind of all done today. So obviously we're going to start. We got 2 slides left to cover, 2 theories we didn't cover. I'm going to cover them first. After which point we can do a little bit of Q&A, and then I'm going to look over some of those practice questions with you and kind of walk you through how you would answer them. So pretty straightforward class. If you've got any questions, look, I actually have the Slido, and I totally forgot that I had it here, and I'll answer those in a sec. Okay, so 2 theories that we need to cover before we get to kind of questions about the midterm or about any of the concepts. All right, this one is called status discontent theory. Okay, so what does status discontent theory basically say about religions and how they operate in the modern world? Basically, when a religion, sees itself as declining, or a decline is threatened in its social status or its kind of social position, basically what happens is people draw in to kind of really strong identities, right? Often they will sort of start rejecting the outside world, and they start to shore up the boundaries, right? So more clearly denoting who are insiders and outsiders, right? Who are orthodox and or heterodox kind of believers or non-orthodox believers. And here I mean orthodox with the small o, not the capital O, which just means people who follow kind of standard religious teachings. That's orthodox with a small o. Small o, who's orthodox and who is heterodox, and typically pushing those who are heterodox out the door. And other kinds of identity, right? Often, strengthening up kind of individual kind of units and cohesion within groups to try and secure the future, right? And often, this can have to do with, renewed kind of vigor and teaching and making sure everybody is solid in their religious identities. Basically when they're threatened or when they see threats, you'll get this kind of argument that they need to create stronger identities. Now, you've probably never heard of this book. There's a really famous book that came out a couple of years ago. It's obviously called The Benedict Option by, I think I would describe Rod, who I've never met, but definitely I've been following for a while, as I think semi-mad, but a kind of interesting figure nonetheless. And he used to have a blog on The American Conservative. Now he has a Substack, and it's kind of fascinating reading. It careens between paranoia and prophecy, and it's quite a thing. Anyway, I could tell you more about Rod, but we have no time. One of the things that he argues in the Benedict Option, though, is that, modernity is coming, right? We're now in a post-Christian world. And so what he says is we need to do, if you're Christian, what the Benedictine monks did at basically the end of the Roman Empire, is consolidate into communities of faith that build really strong identities to resist. And so that when society eventually collapses, there are Christians to once again go out and evangelize the world. And I'm doing a disservice to Rod's argument. And if he was here, he'd be like, that's not what I say in the book, but it's kind of what he says in the book. But you can see that this is kind of status discontent theory in a nutshell, right? Basically, religious groups that thrive, especially in modernity, are those that manage external threats and inculcate really strong identities in the people that they have, like in their audience, right? In their group of believers. So they see the external threats coming for them, right? So that's the status discontent part. So when it's like their status at, say for Christians, the top of the food chain in terms of the social ladder is threatened, they retrench into stronger and stronger identities to basically ensure their survival, right? And this, theoretically has a sort of positive effect, right? You entrench stronger identities, stronger communities. This generates more benefits for those who are inside. It boots out a lot of free riders. And then religious communities become more and more attractive, right? So, however, to some extent, especially in modernity, the strength of particular religious groups really is predicated on having some kind of external threat that keeps people policing this boundary. If there's no external threat perceived, there's the risk of dissolving kind of into the broader society. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay, all right. All right, last theory. Again, this is a kind of smaller theory, a relatively new one, out of Christian Smith's book, American Evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving. And he proposes what he calls the subcultural theory of religious strength. And basically what he says is that, you know, modernity, even the later parts of modernity, we've seen a lot of religious groups that are actually doing pretty well. And he points to American evangelicals, you know, so the sub-branch of kind of Protestant Christianity, as one of, I just want to note, it's not evangelism, it's evangelicals. People get these two mixed up all the time. Evangelism is an action, evangelicals is a group. So just keep that in mind. Because I'm teaching another class with a similar kind of topic, and people are, you know, American evangelisms. And I'm like, that doesn't quite work. But I don't dock marks for wrong letters at the end of a word. Okay, so what does Smith say, right? Modernity can be a place where religions can thrive if they basically have a few conditions and they react to them kind of correctly, right? So what do they need? He says they need to harness a number of factors. Okay, so distinction is one, right? So basically, they need to be, for a religious group to thrive in modernity, they have to be different from the overall society, right? So one of the things that Smith will point to is that the Protestant mainline churches, right? These older churches, and we'll talk about the religious landscape way later in the course, and we'll talk about the mainline. But these older Protestant traditions, one of the things that happens to them in the 20th century is they become very acculturated, right? And they become very much like the culture. And this ultimately, for Smith, leads to their decline. And when you see the way that mainline churches have declined, it's quite striking at the end of the day, right? They have declined enormously over time. So, because they kind of became like the culture, right? They embraced a lot of things. For Smith, they embraced things like women's ordination, LGBTQ inclusion, and other things like this, right? A lot of social justice-y kind of takes on Christianity, which was very much kind of a kind of alignment with the broad culture. Evangelicals, on the other hand, did not, right? They, in most ways, you know, stuck to more kind of small O orthodox kind of Christian tradition on things like female pastors, LGBTQ issues, questions about marriage, right? For the most part, they remained quite small O orthodox about it. And so it created a big distinction between evangelicals and the kind of broader culture. And this distinction allowed them to be like, okay, we know who's in, we know who's out. We know if you have these kinds of beliefs, you're an insider, you're an evangelical. If you have these kind of beliefs, you are, you know, worldly or acculturated or, you know, a mainline Protestant and something like that. Yeah, please.
Did that also work for like the Catholic Church's decline in Europe as well? As to why it's kind of, you know, more culturally seen as just something you do instead of the actual practicing of religion?
Yeah, potentially. There's not a lot of distinction, say, between Catholic practice, at least for the most part. The Catholic Church is weird because the Catholic Church contains multitudes, right? Within the Catholic Church, you have both extremely conservative and extremely liberal elements. And so I would say more on the spectrum of like mainstream and liberal Catholicism would be more like this. There's an argument to be made, although it's not very well statistically backed up, that like the really conservative Catholic communities have actually done better, kind of like American evangelicals. The Latin Mass Catholics will always tell you, our numbers are booming, our churches are full of young people. And I'm like, statistics, please. Your anecdotes mean nothing to me. I don't care about them. I'm a sociologist. I don't want anecdotes. I want statistics. And they're like, well, we don't really have those. I'm like, well, come back to me later then. We'll talk. Well, if you just came out, I'm like, no, that is not going to happen. I don't like Latin enough, although it is a cool language. Anyway, does that answer your question though? Okay. Okay, so that's a distinction. Engagement. Okay. So this is maybe where some people get tripped up on this despite the fact that, they have high distinction, and then the next two as well, or actually the next three, tension, conflict, and threat, all kind of have to do with this idea that, this religious group is somehow apart and in conflict with society. What Smith says is basically groups that have high engagement with that, not internally. I will say this, it's not internal engagement. It's not like you keep your people very active. It's engagement with the outside world, right? That basically you have to remain engaged with the outside world and kind of bringing whatever religious message you have to them in order to thrive, right? That basically religious groups that entrench into themselves and are like, the status discontent Benedict option folks, they're like, we're going to have high engagement, but only inside. Smith thinks that inevitably leads to decline, just a kind of slow attrition. Engagement with the outside world is also critical. So with evangelicals, what he points to specifically is this long history of being out there in public, making arguments. He says really starting with people like the 20th century preacher Billy Graham, right? And a whole bunch of other people around Billy Graham that I won't get into because it's a whole interesting history of evangelicalism, but for our purposes, not relevant. But right, I'll get to you in a sec. Highly engaged, right? And Billy Graham used to do these big, what he called crusades, where he would fill up stadiums and preach to people. So they were always, and they founded things like Christianity Today, this magazine that publishes articles that engages with the ideas of the world and argues against them. There's 100 other examples I could bring, but basically they try to stay engaged. So yeah, first here and then, yeah. Protest or even just like preach or be present in the society, right? They're not like withdrawn only into their own communities, right? So they could be preaching, they could be putting out their own pop culture, right? Or version of pop culture. Have you ever heard of The Chosen? Right? It's this series that's kind of big in Christian circles. It's now on Netflix, where they basically are doing like yet another retelling of the life of Jesus. And it's been very popular, but this is the kind of thing, right? It's like always putting the message out in the world, right? Constantly, preaching and engaging with the culture around them, not retrenching into identities.
Kind of going off that, could you even argue that the reason why subculture theory says you always have to engage with the outside world is because if you only engage with the internal community, it kind of sets a goal. Like, it's an achievable goal, like get everyone in this one community to just agree on something. Like, I know it's easier said than done.
Yeah, I'm like
generations and enough like a part of the culture, you can have your little commune all believe the same thing, which would be status disconnect theory. But then what do you do after that? Then everyone's like, oh, the apocalypse hasn't happened 5 times already.
right.
But if you're constantly trying to convert members, that's kind of an unending task.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, and I mean, there's always going to be attrition too, right? People that leave religious groups. And so then it becomes a sort of demographics game if you're not engaging with the culture. But it's also just like showing the vitality of your own culture kind of internally, I think, for Smith, right? It's like, no, we're not just hiding behind the walls, we're out there in the culture trying to argue things. And it can be things like, protesting against abortion or door-to-door preaching, or things like that. So like the Mormons would be an example too of this, right? Where they're highly engaged with the culture, right? They got their foot soldiers out. Maybe that's the wrong term. They've got their young people out, preaching the word and all that fun stuff, kind of constantly, right? They're not hiding behind the walls of the Mormon church, having 17 babies and just hoping that grows the population that way. Though they do that as well. Not always 17. Sometimes it's 15. I'm kidding. Obviously not all Mormon families are gigantic. Just most of them are. Okay. Does that make sense? We're good with engagement. Okay. Tension. So despite, engagement, there needs to be tension with the society. There has to be something they don't get along with. Otherwise that distinction goes away, right? So they can't be fully acculturated into the world, which is why, like, if you tune into kind of like intra-evangelical debates, there was this debate that just happened this weekend. Like, was it just this weekend or just a couple weeks ago? I can't remember. this one very prominent pastor of a non-denominational megachurch made some comments that were very LGBTQ kind of inclusive, and the whole evangelical space imploded down around him in opprobrium. Honestly, it was just like, no, you can't do this. You can't say this. This is not right. It was like, but that's policing the kind of tension, right? We have to keep this tension around sexuality, because if evangelicals embrace kind of that worldly or society accepted sexuality, that tension disappears, right? It's one of the issues that evangelicals have really held in tension with the culture, is their view of kind of human sexuality. So you have to have that tension. Otherwise, again, you start to get kind of pulled into the culture. You kind of become just a social club that meets at an inconvenient time that no one really wants to be there, with bad coffee and music that's, less good than Taylor Swift. So, again, I joke. I don't mean to insult anybody. But, there is that sense that in Smith that tension's really important, and it needs to be expressed in the form of conflict, right? There has to be this kind of battle going on between your group and the broader society, with you kind of held as, the heroes of the story in a sense, right? And I mean, it doesn't have to be violent, right? We're not talking about necessarily like bombing abortion clinics or anything like that, but there has to be a conflict, right? Where you don't agree, you push back, you're in this constant push and pull with the culture, whether it's rhetorically or in more kind of embodied ways. All good on that so far? Okay. And the last thing, right? There has to be some kind of at least perceived threat. So that broader culture has to basically be seen by the group as some kind of threat to the continuation of your religious group, to your children, all of these sorts of things, right? And that threat can shift. It doesn't always have to be the same, right? And certainly, it can be like in the 80s, for some evangelical Christians, not all, it was like Dungeons and Dragons. That's the threat to our children. If we allow our children to play Dungeons and Dragons, they will be nerdy. No, they will be sucked in by all these demonic images, right? And obviously this is preceded. It's like pop culture. It's the music industry. It's LGBTQ kind of culture. All of these sorts of things, right, have become threats in their own way. And there's been this kind of pushback, this like, we're threatened by this. And this is, for Smith, an important part of keeping the group together. Yeah.
How do they select which things are threats and which aren't?
I mean,
Like barcodes were even seen as like.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, I think it's very cultural, right? It's not like there's a cabal of evangelical wizards somewhere at some meeting. It just kind of like bubbles through the popular culture within these groups, right? It's just like, we've selected this. And there's, I will say, like, for evangelicals, they have their own media, right? So their own media space will sometimes, sort of glom onto something. Like Dungeons and Dragons was driven largely by a group called Focus on the Family, right? Where their founder, James Dobson, was like, oh, this is satanic. We can't have this. And then he put it on his daily radio show and talked about it a bunch. And books were written, like it just kind of spread out that way. But it was very organic, right? It's not, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe Dobson was part of the dark cabal. I don't know. Yeah, please.
According to Smith, would all religion die out if essentially everyone believed in it?
If everyone believed in it, would all religion die out? I think it would have a very, okay, so in modernity, he doesn't think this is possible, right? He thinks very much that, the modern cultures are going to tend towards forms of secularization. Now we'll get into secularization after the break. He's a little bit more on a softer secularization side, which is more like religion loses its prominence in society. So he doesn't think like in modernity, we're never going to go back to like, 1516 where everyone in Western Europe was Catholic. That's just not going to happen. It's not a feature of modernity. So that's not really, I think, even a concern of his. I think he's more trying to describe how evangelicals have thrived and what religious groups that do thrive in modernity look like. And it's having these features. But I don't think he thinks you'll ever get back to, maybe a majority. There's still a majority that are Christian in the US, but like a complete monopoly.
But I kind of meant like if, let's say, 100% of the population believed in the religion, like, is he saying, according to this theory, that that religion would essentially die because there's no one to be in conflict with or have tension with or engage with?
I think there you would probably still have subcultures within it, right? Like there would be, and I mean, you would see this even, like we'll talk when we talk about secularization, about the great revivals that happened in America and England. And it was like, oh, everybody's, Anglican or Methodist, but it kind of got to be a lazy kind of unlived Methodism. So then, or Anglicanism. So then you got these really dynamic groups that felt all of these things, like I guess the early Methodists, and then a bunch of the evangelicals that were then like whipped up religious sentiment to kind of reboost it. So I would guess that's more kind of what he would think. It's like you'd get a lazy kind of lethargic moment, and then people would be like, but we've walked away from God. Let's kind of stir things up and increase that intensity. And the threat then would be seen as like Christians who are inactive or something like that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
With engagement, what would you say about religious societies like the Amish when they kind of pull away from society?
So that would be a completely different kind of phenomenon for Smith, right? And I think he would kind of question whether they are strong, right? Like evangelicalism is different from, say, the Amish. The Amish have survived, but they have no real cultural power, right? Whereas evangelicals have both survived, and at least when Smith's writing this in 1998, although I think it's still true, they're actually still a pretty powerful group, right? They can move things. Like no one is courting the Amish vote. There's just not enough of them, right? And it's kind of closed off. If you're not born into it, I don't even know how one would go about joining the Amish. This is a question I've never thought of because it's never interested me, but now I must find out. But evangelicals have had this kind of strong subculture that's held within American society. And so the Amish, I think, are a different phenomenon. They're more probably sheltered enclave, but they're definitely not they're not a particularly strong religious group, right? So they don't have a vital kind of role in society the way evangelicals still do. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, you give me a thumbs up. That should be more good. Okay, so this one, I hope probably you've read this quote already because we've been on this slide for a little while. But what I think is kind of, so I won't read it to you, but what I do want to point out is one of the things that Smith suggests is, okay, the West, we're in this situation where there's no sacred canopy, right? The sacred canopy has broken down, and so there's no religion that covers everybody, no religious system. But these strong religious subcultures, conservative Catholics, evangelicals, can live under what he calls sacred umbrellas, right? Where their group still has what amounts to a sacred canopy that's just for them. It doesn't cover the whole of society, but they still get all the psychological benefits, the safety, the security, the thought that the world is ordered in some particular way and everything makes sense that happened under a sacred canopy. But because it doesn't cover everybody, they basically live under what he calls a sacred umbrella. Okay, good. I love Smith's series. I like him. He's a fun guy. Okay. Okay. Can the opposite to the dialectic be true? If society changes, the religion changes as well. I think that's a reasonable kind of way of thinking about it. I am a living Rodney Stark fan account. Oh, that's true. Oh, trust me, you ain't seen nothing yet. When we talk about his theories of secularization, oodalali. You're going to be sick of hearing about Rodney Stark by the end of the course, I swear. Okay, so plausibility structure ideas can be used to make sense of people becoming more religious. They move to a more religious context. I think that's a reasonable reading of plausibility structures. Just think of it more broadly, right? Religious ideas only make sense when they have a social basis, right? And once that social basis dissolves for Berger, once a society becomes more secular, then we all of a sudden no longer have, the plausibility structures in the same way. Can I please explain the Nicene Creed example on the plausibility structure slide? Okay, I will go back and I will tell you. I keep having to sort of remember that people, when I make certain kind of statements, people have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Like, I was like, I assume you know what I mean by the Nicene Creed, and I probably should not. So the Nicene Creed, right, 325 at the Council of Nicaea, right, Constantine is sort of sick of infighting between all the Christians, and so he's like, all of you need to get together and figure out what you all believe. So he convenes a council in the Roman city of Nicaea, and they basically lay out the basic beliefs of Christianity, right? So what is this? Why is this an example of a plausibility structure? Because, right, basically the Nicene Creed lays out the structure of the world, right? What is true, what is not true, and what within that framework then is a reasonable set of ideas, right? So if someone wants to know, even like, oh, what's the structure of reality? Well, the Nicene Creed will basically tell you, that, we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen, right? Boom, you've got your cosmology right there. And so everything else then kind of fits into that notion. So it explains, in a sense, the whole world, and everything that is going to be thinkable is going to be, in a Christian society, is going to be contained within these sets of beliefs, right? They'll lay out, who's God, what God is like, who's Jesus, who's the Holy Spirit, how did all this come about, and so on and so forth. And what's the end point, right? That we're moving towards, the time where Jesus comes back to judge the quick and the dead, or the living and the dead, depending on the translation that you like. I like the quick and the dead sounds cooler. It is also a movie title from like the 1990s, and I always thought it was a cool movie. So sorry, hopefully that makes sense. I don't know who asked that question. I'm going to assume that it was good. A good explanation. Okay, what are some examples of compensators? Okay, so compensators, things like, in heaven, you might be poor and starving on earth, but in heaven you'll have an eternal banquet. There'll be no more tears, and the oceans will have passed away, right? These sort of things, right? And you'll have eternal life. You'll be with God. You'll see your parents and your friends again, right? These are all compensators, right? Things you can't get in life, but the religion is like, well, if you follow our path for a really long time and do all of the right things, you'll get these things, but not right now, in the hereafter, right? Those would be religious compensators. There are also, there can be religious compensators in this world, right? You can't be happy because of this, that, and the other thing, but if you follow this path, contentment or peace might be something that you can attain. For exam, can you use historical examples? You can use any example that you think works. Absolutely go to town. Whatever works for you. I'm not fussy as long as it makes sense. I'm happy with it. So tension is more like, okay, so tension is like there's a disconnect in kind of the beliefs, right? So that there is, that other people believe different things than you, and conflict is active, right? There is this ongoing kind of struggle between your group and other groups. How many marks? Each question is worth 10, and I'm pretty generous with the marks. Can I give an example of what a 100% response would look like? I will talk through these with you. And I can try and post for a couple of the questions what a 100% response would look like. They're very varied, and I'm very kind of easygoing with marks. Oh yeah, no, do whatever you need. Any religion, any part of the world. If you want to go to India, China, Bangladesh, Australia, Antarctica, if you can find the penguin religion, I'm perfectly fine, whatever you come up with. I use a lot of Christian examples just because it's the religion I know the best, by far. So, okay, but yeah, no, knock yourself out. Sikh, Baha'i, Muslim, like whatever works for you, just fire away. I'm very open to anything. All right, you mentioned we have to come up with our own examples for causal mechanisms. How about theories? I looked through the theories questions, and it's all just like, there's no make up your own examples. The only example that you might have to think of, and here, you don't actually have to make one up that I didn't think about because I didn't specify it in the question, is for some of these theories, I'm like, what religious group might be an example of this, right? But I'm okay with you using an example that I used or another example that you can think of. So, all right, what does, all right, can I explain? Okay, so subcultures that offer, hang on. So I think that's out of this quote. I'm trying to think where that one comes from. Oh yeah, so so basically what Smith is saying, like religions survive and can thrive in pluralistic modern societies by embedding itself in subcultures that offer satisfying moral orientation and collective identities which provide adherence with meaning and belonging, right? So what Smith is basically saying is, people who want to be religious, right, who have that religious kind of disposition, they'll be attracted to religion, but what they're going to find the most attractive is, religions that offer what they find to be, a satisfying moral orientation, right? Rules, order, a way of living, right? So some kind of morality that is consistent, whole, gives meaning to life, and usually generates good kind of results in the world. One of the reasons Smith thinks that evangelicalism has been one of these is because, its values, right, its moral code, things like work hard, be honest, don't cheat on your wife or husband, are all things that are highly valued in American culture, right? Because American culture ultimately derives from Protestantism. The moral system ultimately, is one that people find satisfying because it aligns with the already existing moral order, right? But it's holistic. It covers most aspects of life, and it gives people kind of rules that they can follow that work, and generally make people pretty happy. Satisfying morally oriented collective identities, right? So you want to be part of a group that has this kind of moral orientation, right? But it's a collective identity, not an individualistic one. Like being part of that group allows you to coordinate, be part of a community, have all those benefits of being with other people who share these values at the same time. Okay, I think that made sense. Okay. Can I explain the sacred canopy again? I mean, sure, it only took me an hour the first time. You could go back and watch the video again, but no worries, I'll do it. Okay, so the sacred canopy is basically this idea that Berger has, that religion basically offers almost like a protective covering to all the other social institutions, because the world is always topsy-turvy, right? It's always chaos. There's always hurricanes, floods, wars, threats of wars. And so without a kind of structuring moral order that's grounded in something more, right, in here, theoretically in the transcendent, everything kind of feels like it's chaos. But the sacred canopy puts society under a kind of roof that says, it's okay, it all means something, right? It all is part of some greater order, some greater purpose, and all of that kind of stuff. So, basically the sacred canopy offers a sort of psychological protection for people against the chaos of the world, but not on an individual level, at like a social level, right? At the level of the whole society feels like, let's put it in very pop culture terms, everything happens for a reason, and we know what those reasons are. I hope that makes sense. Okay. This one's, hi. I will note, yes, fine, do whatever you want. You have 12 minutes per question. Like, they're not timed per question, but if you split up 5 questions over an hour, you have 12 minutes. So use your time sparingly. I will just say that. Also, you do not know which of these causal mechanisms you might get, right? On that one, you get a random selection. You might get 2. So as you're prepping for the exam, you might want to be, judicious in how you use your time, right? Coming up with 10 examples for causal mechanism number 1, but not any for causal mechanism number 7 through 10. You're putting yourself at risk because you might get only one, and it might be one that you have. You might pull 2 of them because that 5th question is a wild card, and there's a lot of causal mechanisms. So not a 50-50 chance, but probably a like 33% chance you're going to pull a second causal mechanism, I would guess. So, you do what you want. You have 12 minutes per question if you're budgeting. So be judicious. Will Tom Holland's discussion be a question on the midterm? Okay, so there is one question on that video clip that I talked about with Tom Holland. Again, it's one question out of like 45 or 50. So your odds of and it's in one section. There's only two parts where you could draw it. Where is it? It's in case studies. It's in the case studies section. So you could draw it either in the case study section or in the wildcard section. But there is a question on it. So yeah, and I had said at the time the video was fair game. Can I explain status discontent theory again? But I just did it. Okay, status discontent. Let's go back to the slide. And then I'll open up the causal mechanisms and look at the ones that you guys have questions about. Basically, right, religion sees itself as in decline, or there's a threat of decline. So religious people kind of retreat behind the walls, metaphorically, right, and start really building up strong internal identities. They, urge everyone to participate more. They strengthen what everyone believes. They kick out those who don't share those beliefs, and anyone who's just hanging on for free benefits that happen to be part of the religious community. And basically, they have this concerted effort to make themselves stronger, but in a little bit more isolation. And basically, what is kind of proffered is that, they manage these external threats. And by managing the external threats, right, the possibility of heterodox beliefs coming in, free riders, things sucking away your vitality, your children, watching too many Hollywood movies and turning away from, or TikTok or whatever, and turning away from the religion, they manage all of these threats, and that allows them to survive and continue on into the future. But their strength relies on the existence of an external threat that they can kind of cast themselves against. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. We have 11 minutes left. You're wrong. I have one more minute. Yes. Okay. You go back and watch. I'm going to say for symbolic universe, it's a big definition. Go back and watch the video again, because they are right. We are running out of time. I'll do these two really quickly. So deep culture and invisible religion, very quickly, is the idea that religion affects a society's system of beliefs so deeply that it lingers on, right? That the whole kind of notion of morality, of meaning, of pretty much why a society understands the world the way it does is ultimately shaped by its religious system, right? And so you could make the argument, and this is really the argument that Tom Holland makes, right, is that the West, why does the West care about the poor and the oppressed in ways that a lot of other societies never did? Well, specifically because they were influenced by, a religion that said God himself was oppressed at one point, right? That Jesus, was a crucified criminal, right? And that's the God of Christianity. And that's who God kind of identifies with, is those who are put down by power, right? And that this has kind of carried forward in Western history, where we think of, people who are being oppressed as having some kind of morally virtuous standing. Okay, that was quick. Can I explain causal mechanism? Number 7, secular transposition of religious disposition and practices. I mean, basically, it's the idea that, even after potentially a religious system sort of is not central to a society, a lot of the ways that it preceded things and a lot of the assumptions that it had will carry forward in the way things are practiced, right? So a lot of, say, things like the way we understand rights, in the West would be ultimately predicated on a kind of Judeo-Christian understanding is sort of it, right? But it's been now taken and completely secularized, right? We don't think of human rights necessarily as coming from God. They come from just being human, right? So basically you've had this religious disposition that then gets translated. Okay, now we actually have 9 minutes. I can always, yes, I can post some video if I don't get through it. On the front, that's open all day. Can we come and ask you questions during class time? Yes, I will be here. You can also send me emails and I will try to answer them as quickly as I can, though that doesn't always help. Although I will say, if you start after 9 o'clock at night, that's past my bedtime. So I will not answer anything. Okay. I've answered all your questions. Some of them badly. But I have answered them all. Okay, let's you can't see what I'm seeing, can you? Oh, computer. Okay, and I just need to switch the window capture to that one. Yes. Huzzah, I win. Okay. Click, 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 click. Make you all dizzy. Alrighty. So, this is one of the case study questions, right? So, Sandra is part of a church in South Edmonton. Oh, you can't see that. Why? Come on. I put extend, not duplicate. There we go. Duplicate. There we go. Now it's the wrong window. What is happening? Everything's going to shit. Okay. Stop it. Come on, you. You know what? I'm closing you. There we go. Now I win. All right. So Sandra is part of a church in South Edmonton. This church views secular Canadian culture as corrupt, and its members genuinely worry that Hollywood and pop music might corrupt their children. Not a caricature at all. As a result, its members tend to primarily consume only Christian media and try to force their children to do the same. The church also promotes programs that reach out to the community. The church is thriving and has high retention rate for membership. Which theory best explains why Sandra's religious group is thriving? What are the key components that this theory suggests allow Sandra's church to thrive in modernity? Right. So I think the obvious one here, would be subcultural theory of religious strength. Right. You can kind of say, okay, there's essentially 3 choices you could make here, right? You could talk about status discontent theory. You could talk about subcultural theory of religious strength. You might be able to make a case for like sheltered enclave, though I don't think it really fits. But some people have chosen that for this one in the past. I think the best one here is subcultural theory of religious strength. Okay, so that would be the first use. Basically just identify, and I'll make sure, I will make sure on the exam questions, I'll put what is graded for each part, right? Here it would be like 5 for identifying, the theory, and then 5 for the components. But I'll make sure I mark that down, all the questions. I think I have it in there, but I will double check. Right, so subcultural theory of religious strength, what are the key components, right? So you would say, okay, so there is distinction, right? There's tension, right? So they view Canadian culture as corrupt, and they worry about pop music, right? So there is some kind of conflict, right? They try to keep their children away from that culture and are suspicious of it, right? So they have that tension, they have that conflict, but they still do community outreach. So that is engagement. So you've identified, 3 right there. And you could say, right, there's distinction because they're holding different values, right? They obviously see Canadian culture as corrupt because Canadian culture has different values than what they themselves are promulgating. And they're doing well because they are managing to, balance all of these things. They're providing, a morally satisfying communal identity to their members and all of those sorts of things, right? So I'm obviously doing this quick because I have 5 minutes left and I want to look at a few others. But yeah, that would be, you pick the theory, and then you think, okay, and because you have the slides and you have your notes open, you're like, okay, what are the marks of this theory? How does this case fit that theory? Boom, you're good. Okay, now if I can manage to find another question without making everything explode, I'll be doing well. I failed, okay. Okay, midterm practice. Okay, let me... Unfortunately, E-class is very awkward about this particular kind of action, so I guess I could just go through the exam. That's what I'm going to do. Change. There we go. Okay, there we go. So Smith's causal mechanism, explain Smith's causal mechanism number 1. That'll be 5, right? So what is causal mechanism number 1? I even give you what it is. Prescriptive teaching. Okay, so this is the idea that religious teachings, right, directly affect society, right? That something that, a religious group teaches, explains something about society. Okay, so give an example, not from the lecture, so something I didn't say. So, I didn't say particularly talk about keeping kosher, right? But a prescriptive teaching from Judaism is that, Jews can only consume certain kinds of food. It has to be prepared in certain kinds of way. Meat to be kosher, the animal can't feel any pain. It has to be slaughtered in a particular way to drain the blood. Yeah.
Is kosher now taken off the roster because you just said kosher?
Yes. Yes, it is. Sorry. Hey, you guys wanted to go through examples, and that precludes certain. But there is another culture that does something similar, which I will not mention. Another Judeo-Christian religion that has a similar kind of view on certain kinds of foods. But if I say it, you can't use it, so I'm not going to say it. There's 3 Abrahamic religions. Christians can eat bacon. Which is the other one? Figure it out. Okay. And yeah, you would just say, it's pretty easy, right? That one's an easy one. They're not all as easy as causal mechanism number 1. So those who draw, CM1 are lucky. Okay. Oh, the time is short. But I can always make a video with the other ones. All right. George Lindbeck. So this is your definitions of religion. So George Lindbeck defines religion as the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. What type of definition is this and why? Okay, so this is clearly a substantive definition, right? So, there's going to be definitions like this. Sometimes they're a little bit tricky, but this is clearly a substantive definition because it's not talking about what religion does, right? It's talking about what's in religion, right? So it's like, men in their solitude as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to what they consider divine, right? That's not really like the social kind of what religion does. It doesn't say religion organizes the world according to whatever, It's like what's in religion? It's men and their relationship to the divine. What are some of the potential problems with this? Well, it obviously excludes a lot of things, right? Because what if a religion doesn't have a notion of the divine, right? So it's as easy as that. And you write it out in more prettier words. And I will speak gooder English. But that's basically how that goes. 1 more minute. I can do 3 more questions. All right, this one's theories of religion, right? Really simple. What's Weber's argument in Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism? And how does this theory argue Protestant Christianity contributed to social change, right? The way Calvinists interpreted salvation affected how they lived their lives, right? And, you go through it in more detail, right? That they were worried that they're not on the list of people going to heaven. So they worked hard to show that they were blessed by God. And for Weber, right, this contributed to social change by fueling capitalism, right? And again, write in more prettier words. Easy peasy. You can get a question like this too. Why does Smith use the term? Because obviously definitions of religion. We also have a couple questions on Smith. Why does Smith use the term superhuman powers in his definition of religion? So why does he, right? Specifically because it includes both things that are transcendent, outside of the world, and superhuman forces that are in the world as well, right? So he's including as many religions as possible by including religions that have powers outside the world and those that have powers in the world. What is he seeking to include? As many religions as possible and those that have varying beliefs on where superhumans fit into the natural order. And what is he seeking to exclude with this? Anything that doesn't include superhuman powers. So human creations like the market, or things like American nationalism. He doesn't want civil religion and all that nonsense. And I think the last one we already did. Yes. And now from looking up into the light, I have like little dots in my eyes. Hopefully that was helpful. Do send me questions. I'm going to do my best to keep on top of email. And, we'll do our best here. I just showed you the whole list of questions, so that's good. I have to edit that.